I've been asked to talk about what I would characterize as a deceptively simple issue, which is what happened to Onondaga Lake. And I say it's deceptively simple because when you look at what has happened to Onondaga Lake, you can see that there are several different levels that you can approach this question from. Now, on one level, you can look at Onondaga Lake, look back historically to a time when it was a pristine cold water fishery that provided spiritual, cultural, and subsistence nourishment to the Onondaga people. You can trace the beginnings of European encroachment and settlement, the development of industry along the shoreline of the lake and the tributaries, and the eventual utilization of the lake as a convenient dumping ground for industrial wastes and sewage from the increasing population in the area that became known as Syracuse. You can look at that as one aspect of what has happened to Onondaga Lake, but the story of Onondaga Lake is also, I believe, the story of what has happened in New York State. And I think that the case could be made that the story of Onondaga Lake is really the story of what we have done to the environment in this country as a whole. And at another level, what has happened at Onondaga Lake, and in particular, what is happening at Onondaga Lake today, is a symptom of a very deleterious shift in the way that people in this community, in this state, and in this country are beginning to think about the environment. And I like to refer to this as the vanishing point of reference problem. And basically, what this really means is you have a pervasive loss of environmental quality such that highly polluted environments become the norm. And it suddenly becomes acceptable to have highly polluted air, water, and land because you've lost the reference point of what it used to be like. And I'll be talking about that a little bit further on in this discussion. So let's look at the first level of Onondaga Lake, which is simply sort of a history of what happened with the industrial development around the lake. And here, probably the most important date would be 1793, which is the time at which James Geddes started the first salt manufacturing facility on the shores of Harbor Brook. That really marked the first large-scale industrial process connected with Onondaga Lake and the Onondaga Lake watershed. Subsequent to that, in 1844, the first soda ash production facility was built on the western shores of the lake itself. That was followed in 1881 with the formation of the Solvay Process Company, which then, a few years later, began the production of soda ash. In 1896, the first city sewers were built, and they discharged the untreated sewage directly into Onondaga Creek and Harbor Brook. So what happened as a result of this first surge of industrialization? Well, what happened was that by 1897, basically 100 years after this industrialization process began, whitefish had disappeared from Onondaga Lake. The significance of that being that whitefish are pretty much the barometer of a cold water fisheries. The cold water fisheries that existed in Onondaga Lake was being destroyed as far back as 1897. 3 years later, in 1900, people were told it's prohibited to harvest ice from Onondaga Lake because of potential health issues. So early on, it didn't take very long for the industrialization and use of the lake as basically a dumping ground to start having some pretty serious public health and ecological implications. Well, it continued on and actually worsened quite significantly. In 1918, Solvay began to manufacture chlorinated benzenes, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what that means. In 1922, the city completed a new sewage system which discharged untreated sewage directly into the lake. In 1940, all swimming was banned. In 1950, Allied Chemical, which was the successor to Solvay, started chlorine production by the mercury cell process. By this time, other industries had located in or near Onondaga Lake, including General Motors, Crucible Specialty Metals, etc. So by 1950, you had a pretty heavy industrialization, not only of Onondaga Lake itself, but of the uplands and along the tributaries to the lake. By this date, 1950, Onondaga Lake was really, for all intents and purposes, pretty much a dead lake. It was nothing more than a convenient sewer and dumping ground for industrial waste and human waste. Well, what exactly has been the effect of all this industrialization in real terms, in terms of what's really going on with the lake? What are the chemicals that are involved here? Well, we can state with some degree of specificity what's going on with the lake today in terms of what chemicals are there because of the process that's been initiated at the federal and state levels to remediate hazardous waste sites. So what happened was, with the passage of hazardous waste laws at both the federal and state levels, the regulatory agencies who had sat on the sidelines while all this was happening were vested with the authority to come in and try to clean up the mess. So you have EPA and DEC given broad legal authority to formulate what are euphemistically called cleanup plans for these various hazardous waste sites around in New York State and the country. Now, this process with regard to Onondaga Lake formally began in 1989 when the state filed a complaint against Honeywell, which in turn was a successor to Allied, under the federal Superfund law. That complaint, that action is still ongoing, and it's in federal district court in the Northern District. And it really provides, and has provided, the legal framework for everything that's been happening with regard to attempting to address the problems at Onondaga Lake that are related to the industrial sources. With regard to the non-industrial sources, the sewage treatment problems, that process has been pretty much occurred within the framework of a lawsuit that was filed in 1988 by Atlantic States Legal Foundation. That case, too, is still in federal court, and it still is providing the legal framework for the attempt to deal with the problems that are associated with the discharge of untreated sewage into Onondaga Lake and its tributaries. I'd like to jump right into the issue of the chemicals that are in the lake today, because in order to understand why the Onondaga Nation is opposing the cleanup plans that are being proposed by EPA and DEC, it's first really necessary to understand what's at the core of this problem. And the core of the problem is we're dealing with some of the most toxic chemicals that are known. And not only are we dealing with toxic chemicals that are known human carcinogens and have a multitude of adverse public health impacts that are documented in the literature, but we're dealing with them at levels that boggle the imagination. But to begin with, it's important to understand that as part of that federal and state hazardous waste remediation process, the agencies are required to identify the pollutants that are on the site and to inform the public why these pollutants are an ecological or public health threat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a document produced by EPA and DEC. It's called a Record of Decision. And the Record of Decision is the regulatory agency's decision-making document where they chose the remedy for the Onondaga Lake bottom. And that remedy involves some partial dredging of highly contaminated sediments and then what's called capping for much of the remainder. So among the chemicals that the agencies have identified as being in Onondaga Lake are what are called BTEX, which is benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. These are all highly toxic chemicals. Let's just take one of them, benzene. Chronic exposure to benzene can result in central nervous system depression, immunosuppression, bone marrow depression, degenerative lesions of the gonads, fetal growth retardation, damage to genetic material, and solid tumors in several organs. Chronic exposure in humans can result in bone marrow depression, anemia, and leukemia. Breathing benzene can cause drowsiness, dizziness, and unconsciousness. Benzene is a known human carcinogen. Chlorinated benzenes. This is another group of chemicals that are found throughout Onondaga Lake and tributaries. Chlorinated benzenes are resistant to chemical and biological degradation and tend to accumulate in fat-containing tissues of animals and humans. Chlorinated benzenes have been shown to cause adverse reproductive effects in invertebrates and fish. Chlorinated benzenes can bioaccumulate in humans and cause adverse health effects such as liver damage. Mercury. Mercury is a known human and ecological toxicant. Methylmercury-induced neurotoxicity is the effect of greatest concern when exposure occurs to the developing fetus. Other adverse effects of mercury include reduced reproductive success, impaired growth and development, and behavioral abnormalities. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs as they're known. Some PAHs are known to be carcinogenic. Several PAHs exhibit low levels of toxicity to terrestrial life forms, yet are highly toxic to aquatic life forms. PCBs. PCBs bioaccumulate in the fatty tissues of humans and other animals. PCBs are considered probable human carcinogens and are linked to other adverse health effects, such as developmental effects, reduced birth weights, and reduced ability to fight infection. And finally, PCDD and PCDFs, which are basically dioxin and dibenzofurans. These tend to be very insoluble in water, absorb strongly onto soils, sediments, and airborne particulates, and bioaccumulate in biological tissues. These substances have been associated with a wide variety of toxic effects in animals, including acute toxicity, enzyme activation, tissue damage, developmental abnormalities, and cancer. So that's the regulatory agency's description of some of the chemicals that are being found in incredibly high concentrations in Onondaga Lake and its tributaries and nearby upland areas. In 1996, the Centers for Disease Control and the New York State Department of Health collaborated in a study on the public health effects of Onondaga Lake. And their conclusion was as follows, and I'm quoting directly from their study. Onondaga Lake is a public health hazard. Fish from the site are contaminated with mercury and PCBs at levels which could cause a high risk of adverse health effects. Fecal bacterial contamination of the lake poses a potential health hazard to recreational users, particularly swimmers. And the conclusion of the study was that over 200,000 people are potentially exposed or have been exposed to contamination from Onondaga Lake. So that's the background of what we're dealing with. And it's probably not too surprising given the history of what's happened out there and the use of the lake for industrial discharges and sewage discharges for such an extended period of time. Now, the solution to this problem, as devised by Honeywell with the approval of DEC and EPA, is to go into the lake and dredge some areas. And for other areas, to build a cap, to basically attempt to entomb these highly toxic chemicals. And just pray that it doesn't get out, because that's really what it boils down to. There is not a single engineer at DEC or EPA who will tell you that this cap will not fail. They will not guarantee it will not fail because they cannot guarantee it will not fail. Caps have already been shown to fail at other Superfund sites for a variety of reasons. And this cap certainly is not going to be lasting in perpetuity. It defies any sort of engineering sense to believe that any kind of human construction of this sort that's underwater and subjected to all the ravages of nature is going to survive in perpetuity forever and ever, and none of these chemicals are ever going to come out of there. The fact is that they are going to come out, and what we're doing is we are taking this problem and we are dumping it in the laps of our children and our grandchildren and their children. And that is not a solution, and that is why the Onondaga Nation is opposing this remedy, because it's not a remedy. It's a postponement of the day of reckoning when somewhere, someday, someone is going to actually have to deal with these chemicals. And let's talk about what is being left in the lake. Honeywell and DEC and EPA like to trumpet that 2 million cubic yards of sediment, of contaminated sediments, are going to be dredged. Well, that's great. But over 20 million cubic yards of highly contaminated sediments are going to be left behind. As a matter of fact, the nation's consultants, Stratus Consulting, did an analysis of this remedy and concluded that after this remedy is implemented, that if a regulatory agency came to Onondaga Lake post-remedy, the lake would qualify for listing on the federal Superfund list, which is the list of the most highly contaminated hazardous waste sites in the country. And that's just because of the volume of highly toxic material that the plan is to leave in place there. Now, the unfortunate fact is that this cap and contain approach to hazardous waste sites is basically what DEC and EPA are planning for virtually every part of Onondaga Lake and its tributaries. All of the various hazardous waste sites, be they underground lagoons or leaching contaminated groundwater or contaminated sediments or contaminated soils, contaminated dredged spoils, whatever it is, put a cap on it. Just cap it. That's the solution. Well, it's certainly an inexpensive solution compared to actually taking the stuff out. But I would submit to you that it's not a solution because it's simply postponing the day of reckoning. In concluding on this subject, I would just like to go back to what I said earlier about the vanishing point of reference. And I think What is probably the most disturbing thing about what's going on in Onondaga Lake today with regard to the so-called cleanup is that this is sort of the accepted approach to how we deal with these problems. We're becoming numb to the degree of pollution that we live with. We're coming to accept as rational and normal that you can't eat fish, that you can't drink the water, that the air is polluted to breathe. And to me, that seems like a very dangerous place to be heading toward. To give just a few facts, today there are over 1,000 hazardous waste sites that have been documented just in New York State. In New York State, there are statewide fishing advisories telling people do not eat more than one meal of fish per week from fish caught anywhere in the state. Go up to the Adirondacks and you look at the Department of Health fish advisories for isolated lakes in the Adirondacks, and the advisories say don't eat more than one meal of fish per week from these waters. And if you're pregnant, it's best not to eat it at all. Or if you're a child under 15,